Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call to duty pierced the cramped break room of the 47th Precinct, shattering the heavy, shroud-like silence that had settled over us. For 20 minutes, I had been staring at the same cup of lukewarm coffee, watching the oily surface ripple slightly with each breath I took. My name is Thatcher Quimby, and I've been on duty on Detroit's east side for 12 years. Over those 12 years, I've witnessed people dying in back alleys, in drug dens reeking of filth and despair, or in million-dollar penthouses, places where money couldn't buy a single heartbeat. But all those 12 years had never prepared me. What happened on that humid August night, as the city held its breath, was something entirely different. My partner, Lowell Breyer, looked up from his phone, his face already wearing that mask of professional detachment we all learned to perfect after our first decomposed body call. Lowell had only been on the job for 3 years, but Detroit ages you in dog years. His hands were steady, though, steadier than mine had been at his experience level. The kid had potential, if the job didn't eat him alive first. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speakers, each word dropping into the room like stones into still water. Unit 47, respond to 1842 Gratiot Avenue, apartment 4B, elderly female, unconscious, breathing status unknown. Caller states patient is Eulalie Finch, age approximately 78, no response to verbal stimuli. The address made my stomach tighten. That building was a known problem, a decaying pre-war structure that should have been condemned years ago but somehow kept passing inspection. The landlord, some shell company out of Delaware, had a reputation for creative solutions to tenant complaints. The last time we'd been called there, we'd found a 40-year-old man who'd been dead for 2 weeks, his body so bloated from the August heat that we'd had to call in a special removal team. The smell had clung to my uniform for days, no matter how many times I washed it. But it wasn't just the building's history that made my skin crawl. It was the time. 2:47 a.m. In my experience, nothing good ever happened at 2:47 a.m. It was the devil's hour, when the city's immune system was at its weakest, when the predators came out to feast. Lowell was already moving, grabbing the jump bag with practiced efficiency. "Another welfare check?" he asked, though we both knew it was probably more than that. Welfare checks at that address usually ended with a body bag and paperwork that would keep us off the street for hours. I stood up, my knees protesting after too many hours crammed in the ambulance, too many years of lifting bodies that had forgotten how to help. "Eulalie Finch," I said, rolling the name around in my mouth like a bitter pill. "You ever hear that name before?" Lowell shook his head as we headed for the rig. Should I have? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had heard it somewhere. Maybe in one of those half-remembered conversations with other crews, the kind of war stories we traded like currency in the dead hours between calls. But the memory slipped away like smoke through my fingers. The ride to Gratiot Avenue took 12 minutes. Though it should have taken 8. Construction on IO-Core 375 had turned the normal route into a maze of detours and dead ends. The city was always tearing itself apart and putting itself back together, like some massive organism that couldn't decide if it wanted to live or die. The streets were empty except for the occasional shadow that might have been a person or might have been a trick of the streetlights. Detroit at night was a different creature than Detroit during the day. It shed its mask of urban renewal and showed its true face, broken, hungry, and waiting. As we pulled up to 1842 Gratiot, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Every window in the building was dark except for one on the 4th floor, where faint, flickering light moved behind dirty curtains. But it wasn't electric light. It had the warm, unsteady quality of candles. Who the hell uses candles in a building with working electricity? "You seeing this?" Lowell asked, already reaching for the radio to update dispatch on our arrival. Affirmative on scene, 1842, Gratiot, investigating now. The building's entrance was a mouth of broken glass and graffiti, the security door hanging off its hinges like a broken jaw. The smell hit us immediately. Mildew, urine, and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made my throat close up. The elevator was a death trap. Its inspection certificate 3 years out of date, so we took the stairs. Each step echoed in the narrow stairwell, our equipment bags banging against the walls that were covered in what looked like water damage but could have been anything in this place. On the 2nd floor landing, we passed an open apartment door. Inside, I caught a glimpse of someone sitting in a chair, perfectly still, facing the doorway. Their eyes tracked us as we passed, but they didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Lowell started to slow down, his hand moving toward his radio, but I grabbed his arm and kept us moving. "Not our call," I whispered, though every instinct screamed at me to check on that motionless figure. The 3rd floor was worse. Every door was closed, but from behind them came sounds that didn't belong in a residential building at 3 in the morning. Not party sounds, not television sounds, but something rhythmic and wet, like someone kneading bread dough over and over again, or like something else, something I didn't want to think about. By the time we reached the 4th floor, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the building's clammy coolness. The hallway stretched out before us, lit only by our flashlights and that flickering light from apartment 4B. The carpet squelched under our boots, releasing a smell that made me gag. "Jesus," Lowell muttered. "What is that?" I didn't answer because I recognized the smell now. Blood, old blood, soaked into the carpet fibers and left to rot in the summer heat. Apartment 4B's door was slightly ajar, that candlelight spilling out into the hallway like honey. From inside came a sound that made every muscle in my body tense. Singing. A thin, reedy voice singing what sounded like a lullaby in a language I didn't recognize. "Dispatch, Unit 47, I said into my radio, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're making entry into Apartment 4B, requesting backup to stage at our location." The dispatcher's response was lost in static, but I caught enough to know that backup was at least 20 minutes out. Every unit in the city was tied up with other calls. We were on our own. I pushed the door open with my boot, keeping my hands free for whatever we might find inside. The apartment was small, maybe 500 square feet, but it felt smaller because every surface was covered with something. The walls were papered with what looked like medical documents, overlapping and yellowed with age. The floor was covered in newspaper clippings, creating a carpet of text that rustled as we walked. And everywhere, on every flat surface, were mason jars filled with murky liquid. The singing was coming from the bedroom. Lowell and I exchanged a look, then moved forward, our training overriding our instincts to flee. The bedroom door was open, and inside we found her. Eulalie Finch was sitting upright in bed, her eyes closed, her mouth moving in that continuous song. She was ancient, her skin like parchment stretched over bird bones. She was wearing a white nightgown that might have been a wedding dress once, long ago. Around her neck was a stethoscope, the old kind with the heavy metal chest piece. But it was what surrounded her that made me stop in my tracks. The bed was ringed with IVs, at least a dozen of them. their lines running not to bags of saline but to those mason jars. The liquid in the jars was moving, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat, flowing through the IV lines and into nowhere. The lines just ended, hanging in the air around Eulalie like a medical spider web. "Ma'am," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Eulalie, we're paramedics. Someone called saying you needed help." Her eyes snapped open. They were completely white, no iris, no pupil, just blank white orbs that somehow still seemed to see us. The singing stopped, replaced by a smile that showed too many teeth. "Oh," she said, her voice like paper rustling. "You're early. I wasn't expecting you for another 7 minutes." Lowell was already backing toward the door, his hand on his radio, but I couldn't move. There was something hypnotic about those white eyes, something that held me in place like a pin through a butterfly. "Who called us?" I managed to ask. Eulalie's smile widened. "I did, of course. Just like I've been calling you every night for the past 12 years. You just haven't been listening until now." She reached out one skeletal hand and touched the nearest IV line. The liquid in the connected jar began to glow faintly, and suddenly I could hear something through my stethoscope, even though it was in my bag. A heartbeat, no, multiple heartbeats, all slightly out of sync, creating a rhythm that made my own heart skip. "Thatcher," she said, and the sound of my name in her mouth was like nails on glass. "You've been such a good boy bringing them to me all these years. All those people you couldn't save, all those last breaths you collected. Did you think they just disappeared?" The room started to spin. I grabbed the doorframe to steady myself, my mind racing through every call I'd run in this building. The 40-year-old man who'd been dead for 2 weeks. The teenager who'd overdosed in the basement. The family of 4 who died from carbon monoxide poisoning 2 winters ago. All of them had lived in this building. All of them had died despite our best efforts. "You're insane," Lowell said, but his voice was shaking. He had his radio in his hand now, calling for immediate backup, officer assistance, anything. But the radio was just static, white noise that sounded almost like whispers. Eulalie laughed, a sound like wind through a cemetery. "Insane? Perhaps. But I'm also necessary. This city produces so much death, so much waste. Someone has to process it, recycle it, make it useful again." She gestured to the jars around the room. "Every one of these contains the last breath of someone who died in this city. Collected, preserved, waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "For the right moment," she said, struggling to sit up straighter. "For when the city needs them most." Detroit has been dying for decades, bleeding out slowly, but death can be reversed if you have enough life force stored up. And I've been storing for 70 years. She touched another IV line, and this time I heard a voice through the static on our radio. A young woman saying, "Please help me," over and over again. I recognized the voice. Sarah Mitchell, 19 years old, had bled out in my ambulance 6 months ago after a boyfriend put a knife in her stomach. Her last words had been, "Please help me." "That's impossible," I said. But even as I said it, I was remembering other things. How every death in this building had felt wrong somehow. How the bodies had seemed too light, like something essential had been taken from them. How the families had always mentioned that their loved ones had complained about nightmares in the days before they died, dreams about an old woman in white standing at the foot of their bed, singing. Eulalie stood up, and I saw that she wasn't wearing a nightgown at all. It was a hospital gown, the kind they put on corpses. The back was open, and I could see her spine through paper-thin skin. She moved toward us with surprising grace, those IV lines trailing behind her like a bride's train. "Nothing is impossible," she said. "Not in a city built on impossible things. The automotive revolution, the race riots, the bankruptcy, the revival. Detroit doesn't follow the rules because Detroit makes its own rules, and the first rule is that nothing truly dies here. It just gets repurposed." She reached out toward Lowell, who was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. Her fingers barely brushed his chest right over his heart, and he gasped. "So young," she murmured. "So much life still in you. Not like your partner here. Thatcher's been empty for years, haven't you? Going through the motions, saving lives because you can't save your own." She was right. I'd been hollow since my daughter died 5 years ago. Drug overdose in a house 6 blocks from here. I hadn't been on duty that night. Someone else had run the call, someone else had pronounced her dead, but I'd never forgiven myself for not being there, for not somehow knowing she needed help. "You know what it's like," Eulalie said, turning those white eyes back to me. "To feel death inside you, growing like a cancer. To wake up every morning surprised that your heart is still beating. You bring me death because you carry it with you everywhere you go." The room was getting colder. I could see my breath misting in the air. The liquid in the jars was glowing brighter now, pulsing faster, like it was excited. Through my stethoscope, still in my bag, I could hear a chorus of heartbeats, dozens of them, all racing, and underneath them, voices. Whispers of last words, final messages, "Goodbye and I love you, and please don't let me die." "It's time," Eulalie said. "The city needs what I've collected. It needs all this life force to heal itself, to rise from its own ashes. And you're going to help me deliver it." She moved back to the bed and lay down, arranging herself carefully like she was posing for a portrait. "Call it in," she said to me. "Tell them I'm having a cardiac event. Get me to the hospital, to the heart of the city's medical system. Once I'm inside, once I'm connected to all those machines, all those other patients, I can release what I've stored. I can give Detroit the transfusion it needs." I wanted to refuse. Every part of me screamed to grab Lowell and get out of there, to let someone else deal with this madness. But my hand was already reaching for my radio, my mouth already forming the words. "Dispatch Unit 47. We have a 78-year-old female cardiac compromise, requesting immediate transport." "No," Lowell said, snapping out of his trance. "Thatcher, what are you doing?" "She's not having a cardiac event. I don't know what she is, but we can't take her anywhere." But I was already moving, getting the stretcher from the hallway, my body operating on autopilot. It was like being in a dream where you watch yourself doing things you don't want to do but can't stop. Eulalie smiled as I helped her onto the stretcher. Her weight was wrong. Too light and too heavy at the same time, like she existed in multiple dimensions at once. "Good boy," she whispered. "You always were my favorite. So dedicated to your work." The trip down the stairs was surreal. The building seemed to stretch and contract around us, the stairwell becoming a tunnel that went on forever. On each landing, doors opened and faces peered out. Not living faces, but pale, translucent ones. The ghosts of everyone who had died in this building, watching our procession with hollow eyes. Some of them I recognized. Most of them I'd personally pronounced dead. In the ambulance, Lowell drove while I sat in the back with Eulalie. I went through the motions of taking her vitals, though the numbers made no sense. Blood pressure, 0/0. Pulse, 200. Temperature, 82 degrees. Oxygen saturation, 127%. I wrote them all down anyway, my hand moving without my control. "You're wondering why you..." Eulalie said, her white eyes fixed on mine. Why I chose you to be my collector all these years. I didn't answer, but she continued anyway, because you understand loss. You understand that death isn't an ending, it's a transformation. Your daughter isn't gone, Thatcher. She's part of what I've collected. Every overdose victim in this city carries a piece of her with them. And when I release what I've gathered, she'll be part of Detroit's resurrection. The mention of my daughter broke something in me. Suddenly, I could move freely again, the invisible strings that had been controlling me snapping all at once. I grabbed the emergency brake lever and pulled hard. The ambulance screamed to a stop, throwing Lowell against his seatbelt and sending equipment flying. "We're not taking you anywhere," I said, my voice stronger than it had been all night. "Whatever you are, whatever you're planning, it ends here." Eulalie's expression didn't change. "It's too late for that." The process has already begun. Every hospital in Detroit is about to receive a patient just like me. Old women and men who've been collecting death for decades. We're a network, a circulatory system for the city's expired life force. You can stop me, but you can't stop all of us. She was right. My radio was going crazy with calls. Cardiac events all over the city, all elderly patients, all requesting immediate transport. The dispatchers sounded increasingly panicked as unit after unit reported bizarre findings, impossible vitals, patients who seemed to exist between life and death. "What do you really want?" I asked. "Detroit doesn't need the dead. It needs the living. It needs hope and investment and people who believe in its future." Eulalie laughed again, that cemetery wind sound. "You think death and life are opposites. They're not. They're partners in an endless dance. Detroit has been dancing alone for too long, rejecting death, pushing it to the margins. But death is what makes life precious. Without it, there's no urgency, no passion, no reason to fight." She sat up on the stretcher, those IV lines still somehow attached to nothing, swaying around her like seaweed. Tonight, Detroit remembers how to die properly, and in doing so, it remembers how to live. The lights in the ambulance began to flicker. Through the windows, I could see the city's streetlights doing the same, creating a strobing effect that made everything look like it was moving in stop motion. In the distance, sirens wailed from every direction, a symphony of emergency vehicles all converging on hospitals with their impossible passengers. Lowell had gotten out of the driver's seat and opened the back doors. "We need to get out of here," he said, his face pale in the flickering light. "Something's happening to the city." "Look." I looked. The sky above Detroit was swirling with lights, not quite aurora borealis, but something similar. Colors that shouldn't exist twisted through the clouds like oil on water. And from every hospital in sight, beams of light were shooting upward, connecting to the swirl like spokes on a wheel. "It's beautiful," Eulalie said, her voice filled with genuine joy. 70 years of planning, and it's finally happening. The city is accepting our gift. The lights were getting brighter, pulsing in rhythm with something I could feel in my chest. A heartbeat, but not mine. The city's heartbeat, if such a thing were possible. "You have a choice," Eulalie said to me. "You can try to stop this and fail, or you can be part of it. Your daughter's essence is in there, Thatcher. When the transformation is complete, she'll be part of the city itself. Every person born in Detroit from tonight forward will carry a piece of the collected dead. They'll be stronger, more resilient, impossible to kill in the conventional sense." It was tempting. The thought of my daughter continuing in some form, being part of the city's future instead of just its past. But I looked at Lowell, young and terrified, but still standing his ground, and I knew what we had to do. "The dead should rest," I said. and the living should live. That's the natural order. I reached for the IV lines surrounding Eulalie and started pulling them free. Each one I disconnected released a sound like a sigh, and the liquid in the jars began to dim. "No!" Eulalie screamed, but it wasn't just her voice. It was dozens of voices, all the collected dead speaking through her. "You don't understand what you're doing. The city needs this." But I kept pulling lines and Lowell joined me, understanding without being told what needed to be done. As each connection was severed, Eulalie seemed to age rapidly, her skin tightening, her hair falling out in clumps. The white in her eyes began to crack like old paint. "You're killing Detroit's only chance," she gasped, reaching for me with hands that were becoming skeletal. "Without this transformation, the city will continue its slow decline. It will become truly dead, with no hope of resurrection." Maybe she was right. Maybe Detroit did need something radical to save it. But it didn't need this. It didn't need to feed on the dead to live. The last fourth line came free, and Eulalie collapsed back onto the stretcher. For a moment, she looked like what she truly was. A corpse that had somehow been animated by the collective will of the city's dead. Then even that animation fled, and she was just a body, incredibly old and incredibly still. The lights in the sky began to fade. The sirens in the distance grew quieter. My radio crackled to life with confused reports from other units. The elderly patients they'd been transporting had all suddenly died, their impossible vitals zeroing out in an instant. Whatever network Eulalie had been part of, we'd severed her connection to it. But as I looked at her body, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her lips were moving. No sound, no breath, but her lips were forming words. I leaned closer, close enough to read them. "See you next time." Lowell and I stood in the back of the ambulance for a long moment, neither of us speaking. Finally, he said, "What do we put in the report?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Cardiac event. Patient died en route. That's all anyone needs to know." We drove Eulalie's body to the hospital in silence. The city looked normal again, its streetlights steady, its sky clear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that Detroit had been offered a terrible bargain and had come close to accepting it. In the following weeks, I researched every death I'd responded to in that building over the years. What I found chilled me more than anything I'd experienced that night. Every single one of them had been an organ donor. Every single one had died with their donation papers mysteriously missing. And every single one had been cremated, their families insisting it was their wish, despite having no documentation. The building at 1842 Gratiot was demolished a month later. The official reason was structural instability, but I heard from a friend in the city planning office that they'd found something in the basement. A room full of medical equipment from the 1950s, all of it modified in ways that made no sense. And at the center of it all, a chair with leather straps and IV ports. A chair sized for a child. I never found out if Eulalie was telling the truth about my daughter being part of what she'd collected. Part of me hopes she was lying, that my daughter found peace in the normal way. But sometimes, when I'm running calls in the middle of the night, I swear I can hear her voice on the radio static. Not calling for help, but offering it. Telling me which turns to take, which protocols to follow, which patients can be saved and which are already gone. Lowell transferred to a different district after that night. He said he couldn't drive past that part of Gratiot without feeling like something was watching him from the empty lot where the building used to stand. I don't blame him, but I stayed. Because someone needs to watch for the next Eulalie Finch, the next collector of the city's dead. Detroit did change after that night, though not in the way Uloli had planned. The crime rate dropped slightly. The number of overdoses decreased. It was like the city had brushed against something truly dark and had collectively decided to step back from the edge. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself to sleep at night. The truth is, I don't sleep much anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see those white eyes and hear that cemetery wind laugh. I see the faces in the stairwell and feel the weight of all those collected deaths. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of my shift, I understand what Uloli was trying to do. In a city that's been dying for decades, maybe the dead do have something to offer. Maybe they're the only ones who truly understand what Detroit needs to survive. But then I remember my oath as a paramedic. First, do no harm. And I remember that the dead should rest, no matter how much the living might need them. So, I continue my work, saving who I can, losing who I must, and always watching for signs that someone is collecting more than just memories of the departed. Because if there's one thing I learned that night, it's that in Detroit, death is never just death. It's currency, it's power, and in the wrong hands, it's a weapon that could transform the entire city into something unrecognizable. The empty lot where 1842 Gratiot used to stand is a park now. Children play there during the day, families have picnics, life goes on. But I've noticed that no one stays after dark. And sometimes, when I drive past on a call, I see candles flickering where no candles should be. One of these days, I'll stop and investigate. One of these days, I'll find out if Uloli kept her promise to see me again. But not tonight. Tonight, I have work to do, lives to save, and deaths to witness. Tonight, like every night for the past 12 years, I'm Detroit's ferryman, carrying souls from one side to the other, never knowing which ones might try to come back. The radio crackles to life. Another call, another emergency, another chance to make a difference. I respond, as I always do, because that's what we do. We run toward death, hoping to snatch life from its jaws. And in Detroit sometimes, just sometimes, death bites back. This is my city, these are my streets, and somewhere out there, in the space between the last heartbeat and the final breath, something is still collecting. Something is still waiting, and I'll be ready when it shows itself again. Because that's what Thatcher Quimby does. I guard the line between life and death, making sure nothing crosses over that shouldn't. It's not much, but in a city like Detroit, it might be everything. The radio crackled with static that sounded like screaming wind, which wasn't far from the truth. Outside our ambulance, the October storm was turning the mountain roads into rivers of mud and debris. My name is Mercy Aldridge, and I'd been running emergency calls in the Colorado Rockies for 7 years. But I'd never gotten used to the way the mountains could turn from paradise to death trap in the span of a single weather system. My partner, Crispin Vale, was gripping the door handle so tight his knuckles had gone white. He'd only transferred from Denver 3 months ago, still thought mountain EMS was going to be easier than city work. The mountains had a way of teaching that particular lesson hard and fast. Unit 19. Respond to 4847 Eagles Nest Road for a 72-year-old male. Possible stroke, conscious but altered. Caller reports, patient is Obadiah Hasker, lives alone. Nearest neighbor approximately 2 miles. Be advised, main road is washed out at mile marker 17. You'll need to take the forestry access road. Dispatch sounded apologetic, like they knew what they were asking us to do. The forestry access road wasn't really a road at all, just a pair of ruts carved into the mountainside by decades of ranger trucks and logging equipment. In this weather, it would be like trying to drive up a waterfall. Crispin looked at me with those city boy eyes of his, still wide with the kind of optimism that mountain work hadn't beaten out of him yet. We could call for helicopter evac, he suggested, though we both knew life flight wouldn't fly in this weather. The clouds were so low you could taste them, thick and metallic like blood in your mouth. We go by ground or he dies alone, I said, throwing the rig into four-wheel drive. That's the choice we get to make out here. The thing about mountain people is they don't call for help unless they're already past the point where help might matter. They're proud, stubborn as the granite they build their lives on. If Obadiah Hasker was calling for an ambulance, it meant he'd probably been having symptoms for hours, maybe days, trying to tough it out with aspirin and prayer. The main road lasted exactly as long as dispatch had promised. At mile marker 17, what used to be asphalt was now a canyon of rushing water, carved 8 feet deep by the storm runoff. The forestry road branched off to the right, barely visible through the rain except for the reflective marker someone had nailed to a pine tree sometime in the last century. Jesus Christ, Crispin muttered as I turned onto it. The ambulance immediately started sliding sideways, the mud offering about as much traction as oil on glass. I'd learned the hard way that the only way to drive these roads was to commit fully, to trust momentum and never, ever hit the brakes. Every instinct Crispin had from city driving was wrong up here. Stop signs and traffic lights didn't kill you in Denver. Hesitation did that in the mountains. The road climbed at what felt like a 45-degree angle, switchbacking through stands of lodgepole pines that loomed out of the rain like accusatory fingers. Our headlights could only penetrate about 10 feet into the storm, turning everything beyond into a gray wall of water and motion. The GPS had given up trying to track our position, the screen showing us floating in a void of unmapped territory. "How do you even know where we're going?" Crispin asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic as the ambulance fishtailed around another hairpin turn. "Muscle memory," I said, which was partly true. After 7 years, you developed a feel for these roads, learned to read the mountain's body language like a familiar lover's. But the truth was, I was following something else too. Tire tracks, fresh ones, barely visible in the mud. Someone else had driven this road recently, within the last hour. In weather like this, that meant either another emergency vehicle or someone who had no business being out here. 20 minutes into the forestry road, we hit the first tree. It had come down across the path, a massive ponderosa pine that must have been growing there since before Colorado was a state. Its trunk was thick as our ambulance was wide, and it lay there like a sleeping giant, blocking any possibility of forward progress. "We walk from here," I said, already grabbing the jump bag and portable monitor. Crispin stared at me, like I'd suggested we sprout wings and fly. "Walk? It's got to be 2 miles still, uphill, in this storm." "Then we better get started," I said. "Stroke patients have a golden hour. We've already burned 20 minutes getting this far." I didn't mention that in weather like this, carrying our equipment, it would take us at least an hour to reach Obadiah's cabin. I didn't mention that by the time we got there, whatever was happening in his brain would likely be irreversible. You don't say those things out loud. Emergency vehicle, or someone who had no business being out here. 20 minutes into the forestry road, we hit the first tree. It had come down across the path, a massive ponderosa pine that must have been growing there since before Colorado was a state. Its trunk was thick as our ambulance was wide, and it lay there like a sleeping giant, blocking any possibility of forward progress. "We walk from here," I said, already grabbing the jump bag and portable monitor. Crispin stared at me like I'd suggested we sprout wings and fly. "Walk? It's got to be 2 miles still, uphill, in this storm." "Then we better get started," I said. "Stroke patients have a golden hour. We've already burned 20 minutes getting this far. I didn't mention that in weather like this, carrying our equipment, it would take us at least an hour to reach Obadiah's cabin. I didn't mention that by the time we got there, whatever was happening in his brain would likely be irreversible. You don't say those things out loud, you just shoulder your gear and start walking. The forest in a storm is a living thing, angry and vindictive. Branches whipped at our faces, leaving welts that stung in the cold rain. The mud sucked at our boots, trying to pull them off with every step. And underneath it all was the sound of water, not just the rain, but streams and rivulets that hadn't existed that morning, carving new channels down the mountainside, turning the stable ground into something treacherous and unpredictable. Crispin was struggling. His breathing labored in the thin air. Denver might be the mile-high city, but Obadiah's place was at nearly 9,000 feet. The air up here was thin as paper, made your lungs work twice as hard for half the oxygen. There, I pointed through the trees. A light, barely visible through the rain and forest, but unmistakably artificial. That's gotta be it. But as we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The light wasn't coming from inside the cabin, it was outside, moving around the structure in a pattern that made no sense. Maybe it's a neighbor, Crispin suggested, though we both knew the nearest neighbor was miles away. We pushed through the last stand of pines and found ourselves at the edge of Obadiah's property. The cabin was small, maybe 600 square feet, built from logs that had weathered to the color of old bones. Smoke rose from the chimney, which was a good sign. But the light we'd seen was coming from a Coleman lantern, held by someone in a rain slicker who was walking circles around the cabin, counterclockwise, over and over. "Hello," I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the storm. The figure didn't respond, just kept walking those circles, the lantern swaying with each step. As we got closer, I could see it was an old woman, her face hidden by the hood of her slicker, her movements mechanical and purposeful. "Ma'am? We're paramedics. We're here for Obadiah Hasker." She stopped then, turning toward us with movements that seemed too fluid, like she was underwater. When she pushed back her hood, I saw a face that could have been anywhere from 60 to 90, weathered by mountain sun and wind into something timeless and unsettling. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and they looked through us rather than at us. "You're too late," she said, her voice carrying despite the storm. "He's already crossing over. Has been since sunset." Crispin pushed past her, heading for the cabin door. "We'll be the judge of that, ma'am. We need to assess him immediately." But the woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You don't understand. Obadiah called you, yes, but not for help. He called you to witness." "Witness what?" I asked, though something in my stomach was already twisting into knots. The woman smiled, an expression that belonged on a skull rather than a living face. The changing. It happens sometimes, up here where the air is thin and the earth is old. People don't just die, they transform. I pulled away from her and followed Crispin to the cabin. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly open like a mouth mid-gasp. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from the fireplace, and something else, something medicinal and sharp that made my eyes water. Obadiah Hasker was sitting in a rocking chair by the fire, but sitting wasn't quite the right word. He was positioned there, arranged like a mannequin, his hands folded in his lap, his head tilted back at an angle that no living person would find comfortable. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but they weren't seeing anything in this world. "Mr. Hasker?" Crispin was already moving toward him with the monitor, but I grabbed his shoulder. "Look at his chest," I said. Obadiah's chest was moving, rising and falling in a rhythm that was almost breathing, but not quite. It was too regular, too mechanical, like someone was inflating and deflating him with a bicycle pump. Pulses. Crispin paused, frowning at his watch. I'm getting 200 beats per minute, but they don't feel like heartbeats, more like vibrations. I approached Obadiah slowly, noting the details that didn't fit. His skin had a translucent quality, like wax paper, and I could see dark shapes moving underneath it. Not veins or arteries, but something else. Something that pulsed and writhed with its own purpose. His fingernails had grown impossibly long since that morning, curling into spirals like ram's horns. And when I leaned close to check his pupils, I smelled earth and mushrooms and decay, the smell of things that grow in the dark. "Mr. Hasker, can you hear me?" I said, reaching for his wrist to check his pulse myself. The moment my skin touched his, I felt it. A shock of cold so intense it burned, and underneath it, a sensation like touching a live wire. Images flooded my mind, the mountain from above, seen through eyes that weren't human. The forest floor from below, experienced through roots in mycelium. The cycle of growth and decay sped up until it was a single breathing organism. I jerked my hand back, gasping. Crispin was staring at me. "What happened?" "I don't know," I said. But that was a lie. I knew exactly what had happened. Obadiah Hasker was dying, but not in any way I'd been trained to handle. Something in these mountains, something in the thin air and ancient soil, was claiming him, transforming him into something that existed between life and death. The old woman had come inside, bringing the smell of rain and ozone with her. She set her lantern on the table and pulled back her hood completely, revealing hair that was white as bone and braided with what looked like pine needles and moss. "My name is Constance," she said, though I hadn't asked. "I've been watching Obadiah for 3 days now, ever since the change started. It always begins the same way. They complain of headaches, dizziness. They think it's altitude sickness or dehydration. But then their eyes start seeing things that aren't there. Or maybe things that are there but shouldn't be visible. The mountain shows them its true face." She moved to stand behind Obadiah's chair, placing her gnarled hands on his shoulders. "He called you because he wanted someone medical here, someone who could document what's happening. He's a man of science, even now. Worked for the Forestry Service for 40 years, mapping trails, cataloging species. He wants his transformation recorded properly." "This is insane," Crispin said, but his hands were shaking as he prepared an IV. "He's having some kind of neurological event. We need to get him to a hospital immediately." Constance laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "How?" "Your ambulance is 2 miles down a mountain that's washing away. The storm won't break for hours, and even if you could move him, it would kill him. The change has to happen here, where he's put down roots." I looked around the cabin more carefully. The walls were covered with maps, dozens of them, showing the mountain from every angle, in every season. But there were marks on them, symbols I didn't recognize, patterns traced in red ink that seemed to follow no logical geographic feature. They looked almost like circulatory systems, or neural networks, spreading across the topography in organic patterns. "What are these?" I asked. Obadiah's eyes moved then, tracking to me though his head didn't turn. His mouth opened, and when he spoke his voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like it was being produced by the cabin itself rather than his throat. "The mountain's nervous system," he said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "I've been mapping it for decades, tracking the patterns. The old-growth forests are neurons. The streams are synapses. The mycelial networks underground are the connective tissue. And sometimes when someone has lived here long enough, been part of the ecosystem long enough, The mountain decides to make them permanent. His chest hitched, that mechanical breathing stopping for a moment, and when it resumed, it was faster, more desperate. It started 3 days ago. I could feel them in my blood, the spores. They'd been there all along, dormant, waiting. Every breath I've taken for 40 years has been preparing me for this. Crispin had managed to get an IV started, though I couldn't imagine what good it would do. The saline seemed to disappear into Obadiah's arm without effect, like pouring water into sand. On the monitor, his heart rhythm was nothing I'd ever seen in any textbook. It looked more like seismic activity than cardiac function. "We need to follow protocol," Crispin insisted, preparing medications with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "Stroke protocol, thrombolytics if we can rule out hemorrhagic, oxygen, blood pressure management." "Your medicine won't work," Constance said. "His blood isn't blood anymore. Cut him and see." Before I could stop him, Crispin had done exactly that. A small finger stick to check blood glucose. What came out wasn't blood. It was dark, almost black, with an iridescent quality like oil. But it moved with purpose, trying to flow back into the wound, defying gravity to return to Obadiah's body. And where it touched the floor, tiny mushrooms immediately began sprouting, white and delicate, growing to full size in seconds. "Jesus fucking Christ," Crispin breathed, stumbling backward. The mushrooms were spreading, following the drops of not blood across the floor, creating a fairy ring around Obadiah's chair. They glowed faintly in the firelight, pulsing in rhythm with his impossible heartbeat. "The mountain has a consciousness," Obadiah continued, his voice growing stronger even as his body seemed to be dissolving at the edges, becoming less solid, more suggestion. Not like human consciousness. Older. Vast. It experiences time differently. A human lifetime is just a moment to it, but sometimes it notices us. The ones who stay, the ones who listen, and it offers us a choice. "What choice?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Obadiah's eyes found mine, and in them I saw depths that shouldn't exist in human eyes. I saw root systems extending for miles underground. I saw the slow breath of seasons, the patient growth of stone. I saw the mountain itself looking back at me through this dying man's gaze. To become part of it, to stop being singular and become plural, to trade human consciousness for something larger. The neurons in your brain die and regenerate. Why not the neurons of the mountain? Why not become a thought in a larger mind? The storm outside was getting worse. I could hear trees falling in the distance, the crack of wood like breaking bones. The cabin shook with each gust of wind, but the fairy ring of mushrooms remained perfectly still, creating a bubble of calm in the chaos. "He's having a psychotic break," Crispin said, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. "Hypoxia can cause hallucinations. Carbon monoxide from the fireplace. There's a rational explanation." "Then explain this," Constance said. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing an arm that looked more like tree bark than skin. The patterns weren't random. They followed the same neural map patterns I'd seen on Obadiah's walls. I went through the change 15 years ago, only partially. I fought it, tried to stay human. Now I'm caught between neither fully human nor fully mountain. I can see both worlds, but belong to neither. She moved to the window, looking out into the storm. There are dozens of us in these mountains. The in-between ones. We watch for others going through the change. Sometimes we help them fight it. Sometimes we help them embrace it. It depends on what they want, what they're ready for. I approached Obadiah again, careful not to touch him. His breathing had changed again, becoming deeper, rattling with sounds that might have been words in a language I didn't recognize. The mushrooms around his chair had grown taller, their caps spreading wider, and I could see spores floating in the air like snow. "Mr. Hasker," I said, trying to reach whatever part of him was still human. "What do you want us to do?" "We're paramedics. We're here to help. But I need to know what help looks like for you." His head turned toward me with a sound like branches creaking. When he smiled, his teeth had become something else, white and smooth like polished stones. "Document it," he said. "Take samples. Make reports. Let someone know that death isn't always death up here. Sometimes it's metamorphosis." "We can't just watch you die," Crispin said, though he'd stopped preparing medications, stopped pretending there was anything in our training that applied here. "Actually, we can," I said, surprising myself with the calmness in my voice. "Sometimes that's all we can do. Be witnesses, be present. Not every emergency has a solution. Not every patient can be saved in the traditional sense." I'd learned that the hard way in 7 years of mountain calls. Sometimes you arrived to find someone who'd been dead for days, their neighbor finally checking on them. Sometimes you held someone's hand while they died because the nearest hospital was 3 hours away. Sometimes you documented things that didn't fit in any medical report and filed them away in the part of your mind that you didn't talk about at shift change. Obadiah's transformation accelerated as we watched. His skin became increasingly translucent, revealing networks of fungal growth spreading through his tissues like a second circulatory system. His hair grew long and white, but it wasn't hair anymore. It was something like Spanish moss, delicate and ethereal. His fingers elongated, the joints multiplying until they looked more like roots than digits. "It doesn't hurt," he said, his voice now coming from the mushrooms as much as from his throat. "That's what I want you to know. What I want you to document. It doesn't hurt. It feels like coming home." Crispin was taking notes with shaking hands, writing down everything he observed, even though none of it made medical sense. Heart rate, impossible. Blood pressure, not applicable. Patient presence with full body transformation of unknown etiology. No standard treatment protocols apply. I was taking pictures with my phone, knowing they'd never be believed, knowing I'd probably delete them later. But something needed to record this, even if it was just for my own sanity, my own need to prove to myself that it had really happened. The storm reached its peak around 3 a.m. The cabin was an island in a sea of wind and water, isolated from the rest of the world by more than just distance. Inside the fairy ring, Obadiah had become something that barely resembled a human anymore. He was a suggestion of a man, a place where human form and forest ecology met and merged. His consciousness seemed to expand and contract, sometimes focused enough to speak to us, sometimes dispersed into the growing network of mushrooms that now covered most of the cabin floor. "The native peoples knew," Constance said, feeding the fire with wood that smelled of cedar and sage. "They had names for this phenomenon. They understood that the mountain was alive in ways European settlers couldn't comprehend. They knew that sometimes the mountain chose people to become part of itself, to be its eyes and ears and memory." "Why didn't you complete the transformation?" I asked her. She was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Fear," she finally said. "I was afraid of losing myself entirely, of forgetting my children's names, my husband's face. So I fought it, held on to my human memories even as my body changed. Now I'm stuck watching others make the choice I couldn't." She turned to look at us, and in the firelight I could see that her eyes had vertical pupils, like a goat's. "But Obadiah has no fear. No family left. Nothing holding him to human form. He's been preparing for this for years, studying it, mapping it. He understands what he's becoming better than anyone. By 4 a.m., Obadiah Hasker was gone. In his place was something that might have been a man once, but was now more forest than flesh. The rocking chair had been absorbed into the growth, becoming part of a living structure that pulsed with bioluminescent light. What had been Obadiah's face was now a surface of bark and lichen, but somehow still capable of expression. "Thank you," the thing that had been Obadiah said, its voice now indistinguishable from the sound of wind in trees. "Thank you for witnessing, for documenting, for not trying to save me from what I wanted to become." The fairy ring of mushrooms began to pulse brighter, and I felt a sensation like static electricity in the air. "You should leave now," Constance said. "When the transformation completes, it releases spores. If you breathe too many of them, you'll start the process yourselves, and you're not ready. You still have human lives to live, human work to do." She was right. I could feel something in the air, invisible but present, trying to get into my lungs, my blood, my cells. The mountain was tasting us, evaluating us, deciding if we too might be suitable for transformation. Crispin and I gathered our equipment, what little we'd actually used. The monitor showed flat lines now, not because Obadiah was dead, but because he no longer had vital signs in any conventional sense. He had become something that existed outside our understanding of life and death. As we reached the door, the thing that had been Obadiah spoke one last time. "Tell them," it said. "Tell them that death is just another kind of birth up here. Tell them that the mountain remembers everyone who becomes part of it. Tell them I'm not gone. I'm everywhere now." We fled into the storm, stumbling down the mountain through mud and darkness, guided more by gravity than any sense of direction. Behind us, the cabin glowed with bioluminescent light that had nothing to do with fire. The forest seemed different now, more aware, as if every tree was watching us pass. I could feel Obadiah's presence in the wind, in the rain, in the very ground beneath our feet. He had become part of the mountain's consciousness, a new neuron in its vast inhuman mind. We reached the ambulance just as dawn was breaking through the clouds. The storm was passing, leaving devastation in its wake. Trees down everywhere, roads washed out, power lines scattered like pickup sticks. But we were alive, we were human, and we had witnessed something that redefined everything I thought I knew about death and dying. Crispin was silent for the entire drive back to town. When we reached the station, he sat in the ambulance for a long moment before speaking. "What do we put in the report?" "Stroke patient deceased on scene," I said. "Unable to transport due to weather conditions." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's it? That's all we say about that?" What else would we say? That Obadiah Hasker turned into a fungal colony, that he merged consciousness with a mountain, that death isn't always death up here? Who would believe us? "I barely believe us," Crispin said, and I was there. We filed our report. Obadiah Hasker, age 72, expired from apparent cerebrovascular accident. Unable to transport due to severe weather. Death pronounced at 03:47 hours. No unusual circumstances noted. But I kept the photos on my phone. And sometimes, when I'm running calls in those mountains, I feel him watching. Not malevolently, just curiously, like the mountain itself is interested in the small human dramas playing out on its surface. 3 months later, Crispin transferred back to Denver. He said he couldn't handle the isolation, the weather, the long response times, but I knew the real reason. He couldn't handle the knowledge that sometimes, in these ancient mountains, the line between life and death isn't a line at all. It's a transformation, a metamorphosis, a change of state that our medical training never prepared us for. I still run calls up there, still drive those impossible roads in impossible weather to reach people who might already be beyond reaching. But now, I know to look for the signs, the maps with strange patterns, the mushrooms growing in perfect circles, the people who've lived alone in the mountains for too long and started to hear them whisper. And sometimes I find someone in the early stages of transformation. Sometimes they want to be saved, pulled back from the edge of something incomprehensible. And sometimes, like Obadiah, they want to be witnessed, to have someone medical, someone official, document their transition from singular to plural, from human to mountain. Constance still lives up there, as far as I know. I see her occasionally, walking the forest roads with her lantern, checking on the isolated cabins, watching for signs of transformation. She's the mountain's midwife, helping people through the change if they choose it, helping them resist if they don't. She told me once that the mountain has been conscious for millions of years, that humans are just its latest experiment in mobile neurons, scattered thoughts that sometimes return to the source. I don't know if I believe her, but I know what I saw that night. I know that Obadiah Hasker didn't die in any conventional sense. He transformed, became part of something larger, older, and utterly inhuman. And sometimes, when I'm driving those mountain roads in the pre-dawn darkness, responding to another call about someone who lives alone and has stopped answering their phone, I wonder if I'll find another transformation in progress. Another person choosing to trade human consciousness for something we don't have words for. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes they share them with those of us who arrive too late to save people from what they're becoming. We're not just paramedics up here. We're witnesses to transformations that medical science can't explain. We're the last human contact for people choosing to become something else. And we're the ones who have to decide what to put in the reports, what to file away in the parts of our minds we don't talk about. This is my territory. These are my mountains. And somewhere up there, in the thin air where the trees give way to stone, consciousnesses are merging, transforming, becoming part of something ancient and patient and utterly alien to human understanding. Obadiah Hasker is up there, everywhere and nowhere, experiencing existence in ways I can't imagine. And I'm down here, still human, still running calls, still arriving too late to save people from transformations they don't want to be saved from. That's the real horror of mountain EMS. Not the isolation, not the weather, not the impossible response times. It's the knowledge that sometimes death is just the beginning of something stranger, and we're the ones who have to watch it happen, document it, and then pretend it was just another medical emergency with an unfortunate outcome. But I know better now. I know that in these mountains, death wears many faces, and not all of them are endings. Some of them are beginnings we don't have the language to describe. And that's what keeps me up at night, wondering if the spores I breathed in Obadiah's cabin are dormant in my lungs, waiting for the day when the mountain decides I've been here long enough to become part of it permanently. The radio crackles to life. Another call, another remote cabin, another person who isn't answering their phone. I respond, as I always do, knowing that I might find another transformation, another person choosing to become part of the mountain's vast, inhuman consciousness. This is what we do up here. We arrive too late to save people from becoming what they're meant to become. And we document it, file it away, and pretend that death is always just death, even when we know better. The mountains are calling, and sometimes people answer, and we're the ones who witness what happens next. The call came in at 11:47 p.m., just as the desert was settling into that peculiar cold that people never expect from a place that burns at 115 degrees during the day. I'm Hollis Vexler, been working emergency medical services along the California-Nevada border for 9 years, and I've learned that the desert at night is a different creature entirely from the desert during daylight. It doesn't forgive, doesn't forget, and it sure as hell doesn't give second chances. My partner Rane Corliss was driving tonight, her hands steady on the wheel despite this being her first year out here. She'd transferred from Sacramento, said she wanted something quieter. The desert had a way of redefining what quiet meant. Unit 23, respond to Highway 1, 27, mile marker 47, single vehicle accident. Bystander reports vehicle off roadway, approximately 200 yards into desert terrain. One occupant, female, conscious but confused. Caller unable to provide further details, states they're continuing to Vegas and won't remain on scene. Dispatch sounded tired, the kind of tired that comes from working graveyard shifts in a place where the nearest backup is 45 minutes away on a good night. Tonight wasn't a good night. We'd already run 2 calls, both overdoses from tourists who thought the desert was a good place to experiment with substances their bodies couldn't handle. Copy that, dispatch. Unit 23 responding. ETA approximately 18 minutes. Rene's voice was professional, clipped, but I could hear the question underneath it. 200 yards off the road wasn't an accident. That was intentional. Someone had driven into the desert on purpose, and in my experience, that never ended well. The highway stretched out before us like a black ribbon, our headlights carving out a tunnel of visibility in the absolute darkness. No streetlights out here, no buildings, no signs of civilization except the occasional reflective mile marker and the faded yellow lines that kept people from drifting into oncoming traffic. The stars above were so bright they looked fake, like someone had thrown glitter across black velvet. "What do you think?" Rane asked, accelerating smoothly past 90. Speed limits were suggestions out here when someone's life was on the line. Suicide attempt? I'd been thinking the same thing, but something felt off. Maybe. Or maybe drugs. City people come out here thinking the desert is empty, safe. They don't realize empty doesn't mean safe. Empty means no one can hear you scream. We'd seen it before. People would drive out into the desert to get high, to have spiritual experiences, to find themselves. Sometimes they found death instead. The desert didn't care about your journey of self-discovery. It cared about water, shelter, and not doing stupid things after dark. Mile marker 47 came up faster than expected, probably because Rane had pushed us past 100 for most of the drive. The bystander hadn't been wrong about the vehicle being off-road. We could see the tire tracks leading straight into the desert. No swerving, no attempt to correct course. Someone had turned off the highway deliberately and driven in a straight line until they hit something that stopped them. We followed the tracks, the ambulance bouncing over rocks and scrub brush, our lights sweeping across a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. Creosote bushes threw shadows that danced and writhed. Joshua trees stood like twisted sentinels, their arms reaching toward stars that didn't care about human suffering. "There," Rane said, pointing ahead. The vehicle was a white sedan, one of those rental cars that tourists always seem to end up in. It had come to rest against a large boulder, the front end crumpled but not catastrophically. The engine was still running, headlights still on, pointing out into the endless desert like they were searching for something, or running from something. We pulled up 20 yards away, standard protocol for scene safety. You never knew what you were walking into out here. Could be drugs, could be violence, could be someone who'd driven into the desert to die and didn't want to be saved. "I'll approach from the driver's side," I said, grabbing the jump bag. "You circle around, check for other victims." "This doesn't feel right." Rane nodded, her hand unconsciously checking the radio on her belt. We both knew that if something went wrong out here, help was too far away to matter. The desert had a way of making you very aware of your mortality. As I approached the vehicle, I could hear music playing from inside. Classical music, something, with violins and cellos, completely at odds with the damaged car and the desert setting. The driver's window was down, and I could see her clearly in the dome light. Temperance Shaw, according to the driver's license I could see on the dashboard, was sitting perfectly upright in the driver's seat, her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel like she was still driving. She was maybe 30 years old, professionally dressed in what had probably been an expensive business suit before the desert dust got to it. Her eyes were open, staring straight ahead through the cracked windshield, and she was smiling. Not a confused smile, not a drugged smile, but the satisfied smile of someone who had accomplished exactly what they set out to do. "Ma'am." "Temperance." "I'm Hollis with Desert EMS. We're here to help you. Can you tell me what happened?" She turned her head toward me slowly, that smile never wavering. Her pupils were equal and reactive, not dilated or constricted. No obvious signs of intoxication, but something in her eyes made my skin crawl. They were too aware, too focused, like she was seeing through me to something beyond. "I found it," she said, her voice clear and calm. "After 3 years of searching, I finally found it." "Found what, Temperance? Are you hurt? Do you know where you are?" She laughed, a sound that was oddly musical, matching the symphony still playing from her speakers. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Mile marker 47. 223 yards from the highway, the exact spot." Rane had circled the vehicle and was now standing at the passenger door, shining her flashlight into the back seat. She caught my eye and shook her head. No other victims, but her expression was troubled, and I could see why. The back seat was full of equipment I recognized but couldn't quite place. Survey tools, maybe. GPS units. Dozens of notebooks filled with handwritten notes. And maps. So many maps. All of them showing this exact stretch of desert. "Temperance, we need to check you for injuries. Can you turn off the engine for me?" I reached for the door handle, but she moved faster than I expected, hitting the lock button. "Not yet," she said. "It's not time yet." 11 more minutes. It has to be exactly midnight. That's when the gap opens. I exchanged a look with Rane. Delusions, possibly psychosis, definitely altered mental status. We needed to get her out of the car and properly assessed. But she didn't seem dangerous, just wrong somehow. Like she was operating on a different frequency than the rest of us. "What gap, Temperance?" I asked, trying to keep her talking while Rane quietly tried the passenger door. Also locked. "The gap between what is and what was," Temperance said, checking her watch. "This spot, right here, it's thin. Reality is thin. Every night at midnight, for exactly 3 minutes, you can see through to the other side. I've been tracking it for 3 years. The pattern of accidents, disappearances, sightings, they all center on this spot." She pulled out a notebook from beside her seat, holding it up so I could see pages covered with dates, times, coordinates. It looked like the work of someone either brilliant or completely insane. Maybe both. "These are all the incidents from the last decade," she continued. "Single vehicle accidents with no explanation. Drivers who claimed they saw another highway, another desert, overlapping with this one. Missing persons who were found days later, hundreds of miles away, with no memory of how they got there. It's all connected to this spot. Midnight at mile marker 47. Rane had given up on the doors and was now on her radio, quietly requesting backup and giving our exact coordinates. But I knew what she was thinking. The nearest unit was in Baker. 40 minutes away minimum. We were on our own with someone who was either having a psychiatric emergency or had stumbled onto something that would explain the unusual number of incidents along this stretch of highway. Temperance, what you're describing sounds like you've been under a lot of stress. Sometimes when we fixate on patterns, we start seeing connections that aren't really there. Why don't you come with us? Get checked out at the hospital. You can bring your research. She shook her head, still smiling. You don't believe me. That's okay. No one believed the others either. But you'll see in, she checked her watch again, 7 minutes. You'll see what they saw before they disappeared. Who disappeared? I asked, though I was already remembering the cases. 3 drivers in the last 2 years, all found walking along the highway days after their cars were discovered abandoned at almost this exact spot. None of them could explain what had happened, and all of them had been committed for psychiatric evaluation after claiming they'd driven into another world. Marcus Chen disappeared for 6 days in 2021. Sarah Williams gone for 4 days in 2022. Robert Torres, missing for a week just 3 months ago. All of them were found in a dissociative state, claiming they'd been driving on a highway that doesn't exist, through a desert that shouldn't be there. She turned in her seat to face me fully, and I could see now that she had something in her hand. Not a weapon, but a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit with extra antennas and wires attached to equipment in the back seat. I'm not going to disappear like them, she said. I'm prepared. I've mapped the anomaly, calculated the exact entry and exit points. I know how to get back. The classical music from her stereo suddenly cut out, replaced by static. But not normal static. This had a pattern to it, a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. Rain, I said quietly, get the sedatives ready. We might need to medicate her for transport. But Ron wasn't listening to me. She was staring at her watch, then at her phone, then at the ambulance's dashboard clock visible through the windshield. Hollis, she said, her voice tight. What time do you have? I checked my watch. 11:56 p.m. 4 minutes to midnight. Why? Because my watch says 12:03, my phone says 11:51, and the ambulance clock is spinning backwards. I looked at the ambulance and felt my stomach drop. She was right. The digital clock on the dashboard was cycling through numbers in reverse, like someone was rewinding time. The static from Temperance's radio was getting louder, and now I could hear something underneath it. Voices, maybe, or wind, or something that wasn't quite either. It's starting early, Temperance said, sounding delighted. Your presence must be amplifying it. 3 people, 3 different temporal signatures. It's creating resonance. She started the engine again, the damaged car somehow roaring to life despite the crumpled front end. Get in if you want to see, but decide quickly. The gap only stays open for 3 minutes. Every instinct I had as a paramedic said to pull her from the car, sedate her if necessary, get her to psychiatric help. But something else, something deeper, was curious. The desert did have mysteries. We'd all seen things we couldn't explain. Lights in the sky that weren't aircraft, sounds that shouldn't exist, patients who told stories that were too consistent to be delusions. Hollis, we need to get her out of there, Ron said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was staring at the desert beyond the car's headlights, and her expression was one of growing alarm. Do you see that? I followed her gaze and felt my breath catch. The desert was wrong. Not obviously, not dramatically, but wrong in a way that made my brain hurt trying to process it. The Joshua trees were bending in a wind that I couldn't feel. The stars above were moving, slowly but visibly, sliding across the sky in patterns that violated everything I knew about astronomy. And there, just at the edge of the headlight beams, was something that looked like road. Black asphalt that shouldn't exist, running parallel to nothing, leading nowhere. The gap, Temperance breathed. It's opening. The other highway is showing through. She put the car in gear, and I had a split second to make a decision. Let her drive into whatever madness she thought she'd found, or try to stop her and possibly miss the chance to understand what had been happening along this stretch of desert for years. I made the wrong choice. Or maybe the right one. I'm still not sure. I jumped into the passenger seat just as she hit the accelerator. Rain shouted something behind us, but it was lost in the sound of the engine and the growing static from the radio. The car lurched forward, damaged suspension protesting, heading straight for that impossible piece of road that shouldn't exist. The moment our tires hit that other asphalt, everything changed. The static from the radio became clear voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all talking at once in languages I didn't recognize. The desert outside the windows was the same, but different. The plants were wrong, twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. The sky was the wrong color, a deep purple that pulsed like a heartbeat. And the road stretched out ahead of us, black and perfect, leading toward mountains that didn't exist in our world. Jesus Christ, I whispered, gripping the door handle so hard my knuckles went white. What is this? Temperance was laughing now, tears streaming down her face. It's the between place. The highway that runs under all highways. The desert that exists in the gaps between real deserts. I knew it was here. 3 years of research, and I was right. She pressed harder on the accelerator, the speedometer climbing past 60, 70, 80. The damaged car shouldn't have been able to go that fast, but the rules were different here. Physics worked differently, or maybe didn't work at all. Through the windshield, I could see other vehicles on this impossible road. Not many, maybe a dozen, all driving in the same direction we were. Some looked modern, others ancient, like they were from different decades all sharing the same space. In one, I could see a family from what looked like the 1950s. In another, someone in clothes that seemed to shimmer and shift, like they were from a time that hadn't happened yet. They're all the people who found the gap, Temperance said. Everyone who drove off the real highway and onto this one. Some by accident, some on purpose. They're all still here, still driving, looking for the way back. Why don't they just turn around? I asked, though my voice sounded strange in my own ears, like it was coming from very far away. Because there is no back, she said. Once you're on this highway, direction becomes meaningless. You drive forward because that's all there is. Unless you know the exit points. Unless you've mapped them like I have. She pulled out her modified GPS unit, and I could see it was going crazy, numbers scrolling across the screen faster than I could read them. But Temperance seemed to understand what she was seeing. 3 minutes, she said. That's how long the gap stays open. 3 minutes to get in, find what you're looking for, and get out. Miss the window, and you're stuck here until the next gap opens. But the gaps don't open in the same place twice. You could be trapped for days, weeks, driving this endless highway, looking for an exit that might never come. I thought about Marcus Chen, Sarah Williams, Robert Torres. All found days later, dissociative, claiming they'd been driving on a highway that didn't exist. They'd found their way back somehow, but at what cost? What did days on this impossible road do to a human mind? Why? I asked. Why did you want to find this? What's the point? Temperance's smile faltered for the first time. My sister. She disappeared on this stretch of highway 5 years ago. Car found abandoned, no sign of her. Everyone said she ran away, started a new life somewhere. But I knew better. I knew she'd found the gap, driven through, gotten lost on this highway. I've been looking for her ever since. She pointed ahead, and I saw something that made my heart stop. A car on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking in a rhythm that matched the static we'd heard earlier.
It was old, covered in dust that looked like it had been accumulating for years. But I recognized the model, remembered it from a missing person bulletin years ago. "That's her car," Temperance whispered. "She's here?" "She's been here all this time." She pulled over, and I found myself getting out with her, despite every rational part of my brain screaming at me to stay in the vehicle. The air outside was wrong, too thick, too thin, both at once. It tasted like copper and ozone, like the moment before lightning strikes. The other car was empty, but there were signs of habitation. Food wrappers that looked fresh but were dated from years ago. Water bottles that were full but covered in dust. And notebooks, so many notebooks, filled with the same kind of observations Temperance had been making. Maps of the impossible highway, calculations of gap openings, theories about the nature of this place. She was trying to find her way back, Temperance said, running her hands over her sister's notes. But she didn't have the right equipment. Didn't understand the pattern. She's been walking, looking for another gap, another way home. I looked around the endless desert, the impossible highway stretching in both directions, and felt a despair so profound it was almost physical. "Temperance, we need to go. Your 3 minutes must be almost up." She checked her device, and her face went pale. 30 seconds. We have 30 seconds to get back to the entry point." We ran back to her damaged car, and she threw it in reverse, speeding backwards down the impossible highway. The other vehicles we'd seen were gone now, or maybe we were on a different layer of the road. The physics of this place made no sense. 20 yards, 50, 100. The landscape outside blurred, twisted, became something that shouldn't exist. And then, suddenly, we were back in the real desert, the normal stars above us, Rain's shocked face visible through the windshield as we skidded to a stop inches from our ambulance. "Holy shit!" I gasped, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the door handle. That wasn't... "Real?" Temperance supplied. "It was real. Just not our real. And my sister is still there, still looking for a way home. But now I know how to find her. I know when the next gap opens, where it'll be. I can go back. I can bring her home." Rain was at my door, pulling it open, her face a mix of relief and confusion. "Hollis, what the hell just happened? You were gone for 3 minutes. The car just vanished."
And then reappeared, but it looked like you drove through something that wasn't there. I got out of the car on unsteady legs, my mind trying to process what I'd experienced. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination. Maybe carbon monoxide from the damaged engine. Maybe something in the desert air. But I could still taste that copper ozone flavor. Could still hear the echo of those 1,000 voices from the radio. Could still see that impossible highway when I closed my eyes. "We need to Baker Act her," Rane was saying. "She's clearly having a psychiatric emergency. And you might need to be evaluated too. You're not making sense." But I was looking at Temperance, who was calmly gathering her notebooks, her equipment, her 3 years of research. She wasn't insane. She was probably the sanest person I'd ever met, because she'd seen something impossible and had responded by trying to understand it rather than deny it. "The next gap opens in 4 days, she told me. Mile marker 51, 300 yards northeast, 2:17 a.m. I'm going back for my sister. You could come with me. 2 people would be safer than 1. I wanted to say yes. Part of me, the part that had always been drawn to the mysteries of the desert, wanted to go back to that impossible highway and explore it properly. But the paramedic in me, the part that was responsible for saving lives in the real world, knew I couldn't. "We have to take you to the hospital," I told her. "It's protocol for altered mental status after an accident." She nodded, unsurprised. "I know, but I'll discharge myself within 24 hours, and in 4 days I'll be back." with or without help. We transported her to the hospital in Barstow, a quiet ride with no mention of what we'd experienced. The official report stated that we'd found her confused but cooperative after a single vehicle accident, possibly suffering from exhaustion and dehydration. No mention of impossible highways or gaps in reality, or the 3 minutes that had felt like hours. But I kept her card, and 4 days later, at 2:17 a.m., I was parked at mile marker 51, watching the desert with my headlights off. I didn't see Temperance, didn't see any gap opening, didn't see anything unusual at all. Either she'd been wrong about the timing, or she'd found another way in. Or maybe the whole thing had been a shared hallucination after all. A week later, the news reported that 2 women had been found walking along Highway 127, disoriented but unharmed. Temperance Shaw and her sister Rebecca missing for 5 years. Neither could adequately explain where they'd been, and both were hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation. But before they were taken away, Temperance caught my eye at the scene and smiled that same satisfied smile. She'd done it. She'd found her sister on that impossible highway and brought her home. And in that moment, I understood that the desert held secrets that our medical training, our scientific understanding, our rational minds could never fully grasp. There were gaps in reality, places where the normal rules didn't apply, and sometimes people fell through them. Most never found their way back. But a few, the ones who were brave enough, or crazy enough, or desperate enough to map the impossible, could navigate those gaps and return. I still work the desert highways, still respond to single vehicle accidents at odd hours in remote locations, and sometimes, just sometimes, I find drivers who talk about seeing another road, another desert, another reality just beyond the headlight beams. I don't put it in the reports. I tell them they're confused, possibly concussed, that the desert plays tricks on tired minds. But I also slip them my card and tell them to call me if they want to talk about what they really saw. Because someone needs to keep track of the gaps, document the patterns, understand the highway that runs beneath all highways. Rane transferred back to Sacramento 6 months later. She never mentioned what she'd seen that night, but I could tell it had changed her. The desert does that. Shows you something impossible and then dares you to pretend you didn't see it. Some people can't handle that challenge. They flee back to cities where reality is solid and predictable and boring. But some of us stay. We stay because we know the desert has more secrets to reveal. We stay because someone needs to be here when the next person drives through a gap in reality. We stay because we've seen the impossible highway and know that our world is just one layer of something much stranger and more complex. I've never driven through another gap, but sometimes, on clear nights when the stars are too bright and the desert is too quiet, I can feel them. Thin spots in reality where our world brushes against something else. I drive past them carefully, maintaining my speed, keeping my eyes on the real road. Because I have work, and then reappeared, but it looked like you drove through something that wasn't there. I got out of the car on unsteady legs, my mind trying to process what I'd experienced. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, maybe carbon monoxide from the damaged engine, maybe something in the desert air. But I could still taste that copper ozone flavor, could still hear the echo of those 1,000 voices from the radio, could still see that impossible highway when I closed my eyes. We need to Baker Act her, Rane was saying. She's clearly having a psychiatric emergency, and you might need to be evaluated too. You're not making sense. But I was looking at Temperance, who was calmly gathering her notebooks, her equipment, her 3 years of research. She wasn't insane. She was probably the sanest person I'd ever met, because she'd seen something impossible, and had responded by trying to understand it rather than deny it. The next gap opens in 4 days, she told me. Mile marker 51, 300 yards northeast, 2:17 a.m. I'm going back for my sister. You could come with me. 2 people would be safer than 1. I wanted to say yes. Part of me, the part that had always been drawn to the mysteries of the desert, wanted to go back to that impossible highway and explore it properly. But the paramedic in me, the part that was responsible for saving lives in the real world, knew I couldn't. We have to take you to the hospital, I told her. It's protocol for altered mental status after an accident. She nodded, unsurprised. I know, but I'll discharge myself within 24 hours, and in 4 days I'll be back, with or without help. We transported her to the hospital in Barstow, a quiet ride with no mention of what we'd experienced. The official report stated that we'd found her confused but cooperative after a single vehicle accident, possibly suffering from exhaustion and dehydration. No mention of impossible highways or gaps in reality, or the 3 minutes that had felt like hours. But I kept her card, and 4 days later, at 2:17 a.m., I was parked at mile marker 51, watching the desert with my headlights off. I didn't see Temperance, didn't see any gap opening, didn't see anything unusual at all. Either she'd been wrong about the timing, or she'd found another way in. Or maybe the whole thing had been a shared hallucination after all. A week later, the news reported that 2 women had been found walking along Highway 127, disoriented but unharmed. Temperance Shaw and her sister Rebecca missing for 5 years. Neither could adequately explain where they'd been, and both were hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation. But before they were taken away, Temperance caught my eye at the scene and smiled that same satisfied smile. She'd done it. She'd found her sister on that impossible highway and brought her home. And in that moment, I understood that the desert held secrets that our medical training, our scientific understanding, our rational minds could never fully grasp. There were gaps in reality, places where the normal rules didn't apply, and sometimes people fell through them. Most never found their way back. But a few, the ones who were brave enough, or crazy enough, or desperate enough to map the impossible, could navigate those gaps and return. I still work the desert highways, still respond to single vehicle accidents at odd hours in remote locations, and sometimes, just sometimes, I find drivers who talk about seeing another road, another desert, another reality just beyond the headlight beams. I don't put it in the reports. I tell them they're confused, possibly concussed, that the desert plays tricks on tired minds. But I also slip them my card and tell them to call me if they want to talk about what they really saw. Because someone needs to keep track of the gaps, document the patterns, understand the highway that runs beneath all highways. Rani transferred back to Sacramento 6 months later. She never mentioned what she'd seen that night, but I could tell it had changed her. The desert does that. Shows you something impossible and then dares you to pretend you didn't see it. Some people can't handle that challenge. They flee back to cities where reality is solid and predictable and boring. But some of us stay. We stay because we know the desert has more secrets to reveal. We stay because someone needs to be here when the next person drives through a gap in reality. We stay because we've seen the impossible highway and know that our world is just one layer of something much stranger and more complex. I've never driven through another gap, but sometimes, on clear nights when the stars are too bright and the desert is too quiet, I can feel them. Thin spots in reality where our world brushes against something else. I drive past them carefully, maintaining my speed, keeping my eyes on the real road. Because I have work to do in this world, lives to save, calls to respond to. But I know they're there, the gaps, the other highways, the places where desperate people search for lost loved ones and sometimes, against all odds and logic and reason, find them. This is my territory, these are my highways. And somewhere out there, running parallel to the roads we know, is a network of impossible paths that connect to places we're not meant to go. Temperance proved you could navigate them and return. But at what cost? She and her sister were never quite the same, never quite solid, like part of them had been left behind on that other highway. They moved away eventually, disappeared into normal lives in normal places. But I know they still dream of that impossible road. Because once you've driven it, once you've felt the wrongness of that other desert, you can never fully return to believing the world is what it seems. The radio crackles. Another call. Another accident. Another driver who might have seen something they shouldn't have. I respond, as I always do, ready to provide medical care and rational explanations, but also ready, if needed, to believe the impossible. Because in the desert, at the wrong time in the wrong place, reality is negotiable. And someone needs to be there when people accidentally negotiate themselves into places they can't escape from alone. The storm surge warnings had been broadcasting for 6 hours when we got the call. I'm Jared Osgood, been working coastal emergency response in Louisiana for 11 years, and I knew what those warnings meant. Not just flooding, but the kind of water that doesn't care about human plans or preparations. My partner, Delphine Kittredge, was already suiting up in water rescue gear when dispatch came through the radio. Unit 31, respond to 1847 Bayou Road for wellness check. Peregrine Lyle, age 67, has not evacuated despite mandatory orders. Neighbor reports lights still on in the residence. Be advised, water levels rising rapidly in that sector. Delphine looked at me with those sharp green eyes of hers, the ones that had seen too many hurricanes to be surprised by anything anymore. Bayou Road's already at 2 feet according to the gauges, she said. It'll be 4 by the time we get there. The rain hammered our ambulance like bullets, each drop a small fist trying to punch through the windshield. The wipers couldn't keep up, turning the world outside into an impressionist painting of grays and blacks. The emergency lights reflected off the water that was already claiming the streets, turning everything into a kaleidoscope of red and blue. Peregrine Lyle, I said, testing the name. You know him. Delphine nodded, her hands steady on the wheel despite the ambulance hydroplaning every few seconds. Everyone knows Peregrine. Lives in that old plantation house that's been in his family since before the Civil War. He never evacuates. Says the house has survived worse. But this wasn't just worse. This was different. The storm had stalled offshore, spinning in place like it was waiting for something. The meteorologist couldn't explain it. Hurricanes weren't supposed to just stop and spin in place for 12 hours, dumping rain like the sky had opened a vein. The industrial district was already underwater. The cemetery had become a lake with headstones poking through like fingers. And Bayou Road, where Peregrine Lyle lived in his ancestral home, was turning into a river that remembered when it used to own this land. We had to abandon the ambulance 3 blocks from the house. The water was too deep, too fast, carrying debris that could punch through our windshield like tissue paper. We waded in, the water cold and thick with things I didn't want to identify. The current tried to knock us down with every step, and I could feel things brushing against my legs, some of them solid, some of them not. There, Delphine pointed through the rain. The house rose from the water like a ship, 3 stories of antebellum architecture that had no business still standing. The first floor was completely submerged, but lights flickered in the upper windows. Not electric lights, the power had been out for hours. These were candles, dozens of them, creating a warm glow that seemed to push back against the storm. We waded to the porch, now underwater, and found the front door open. Not forced open by the water, but deliberately opened, like someone was expecting guests. The inside was a disaster of floating furniture and destroyed memories. Family portraits bobbed in the water, their painted eyes seeming to follow us as we waded through what had once been a grand foyer. "Mr. Lyle," I called out. "Peregrine. We're paramedics. We're here to evacuate you." A voice drifted down from upstairs, calm and measured, like we were arriving for tea rather than rescue. "Up here, second floor. Do come up, though mind the third step. It's been loose since 1987. The staircase was still solid, built from cypress that had learned to resist water centuries ago." We climbed carefully, our boots squelching with each step, leaving puddles that immediately began dripping through to join the flood below. The second floor was dry, but only just. Water was seeping through the floorboards, creating dark stains that spread like blood. Peregrine Lyle sat in a wingback chair in what must have been a library. He was thin, almost skeletal, with white hair that reached his shoulders and eyes that were the same gray as the storm outside. He wore a three-piece suit that looked older than me, and he was writing in a leather journal, completely calm despite the house groaning around him like a dying whale. "Mr. Lyle," Delphine said gently, "we need to get you out of here. The house won't hold much longer." He looked up at us with those storm-colored eyes and smiled. "On the contrary, Miss Kittredge, the house will hold precisely as long as it needs to. It always has." He gestured to the walls around us, and I noticed they were covered with documents. Not just any documents, but records dating back centuries. Birth certificates, death certificates, land deeds, marriage licenses. An entire family history displayed like evidence in a crime that spanned generations. "This is the 7th time this house has flooded," Peregrine continued, returning to his writing. 1856, 1893, 1927, 1965, 1992, 2005, and now. 7 floods for 7 sins, though I suspect you're not interested in biblical numerology. I wasn't, but something about the dates nagged at me. They weren't random. Each flood had been exactly 37 years after the previous one, except for the gap between 1927 and 1965. The pattern had been broken, then resumed. "We're interested in your safety," I said, checking his vitals without touching him. His breathing was steady but shallow. His color was off, too pale, with a bluish tint that suggested poor circulation. The water's rising faster than predicted. This whole area will be underwater within the hour. "Yes," he said simply. "That's rather the point." He turned the journal toward us, and I could see he was writing names. Hundreds of names, each with a date beside it. Some of the dates went back to the 1800s. "Every person who died because of what this house represents," he explained. "Every slave who worked the plantation, every freedman who was cheated out of wages, every family destroyed by the wealth this place generated. I've been documenting them for 40 years, and tonight, finally, the ledger will be balanced." Delphine and I exchanged glances. Survivor's guilt taken to an extreme, or maybe something more. The house groaned again, and I could hear water rushing somewhere inside the walls. The flood had found a way in, was filling the spaces between the walls like blood-filling veins. "Mr. Lyle," Delphine said, "whatever you think you're atoning for, drowning yourself won't fix it." He laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. I'm not drowning myself, my dear. I'm returning what was taken. This land was stolen from the water, from the bayou, from the swamp. My ancestors drained it, built levees, forced it to be something it wasn't. And in doing so, they destroyed countless lives. The water wants it back. Has always wanted it back. I'm simply facilitating the transaction. The lights flickered, the candles guttering in a wind that shouldn't exist in a closed room. And in that strobing light, I saw something that made my blood cold. The water stains on the floor weren't random. They were forming patterns, words maybe, or symbols. And they were moving, spreading across the floor in deliberate paths, like something was writing with water from below. "We need to go," I said, grabbing for Peregrine's arm. "Now." But he pulled away with surprising strength. "I've been preparing for this for 7 years," he said. "Ever since I found the records. Do you know what this house is built on?" I didn't want to know, but Delphine answered. "The old Acadian settlement. Before the plantation, before the Spanish, before any of it." Peregrine nodded approvingly. "A village of people who knew how to live with the water, not against it. My ancestors burned it down, built this monument to human arrogance on the ashes, and now the water is reclaiming what was always its own." The house lurched suddenly, tilting at an angle that shouldn't be possible. Through the windows, I could see that the water outside wasn't behaving like floodwater should. It was rotating around the house, creating a whirlpool with the building at its center. "That's impossible," I breathed. Peregrine stood up, his movements fluid despite his apparent age. "Nothing's impossible during a flood. The normal rules don't apply when the water takes over. Haven't you noticed? Your radios don't work. Your phones are dead. Time moves differently here. We've been talking for 5 minutes, but check your watch." I looked at my watch and felt my stomach drop. We'd been in the house for an hour. How was that possible? We'd only climbed the stairs and had a brief conversation. "The water changes things," Peregrine said, walking to the window. "It remembers what this land was before humans tried to control it. And sometimes, during floods like this, it tries to restore things to their original state." The water was rising faster now, seeping through the floor in earnest. But it wasn't just water. There were things in it, shadows that moved independently, shapes that might have been fish or might have been something else, and sounds, voices almost, speaking in languages that predated French, Spanish, or English in these lands. "We're leaving," Delphine said firmly. "With or without you." But when she moved toward the door, it wouldn't open. Not locked, not stuck, just wouldn't open, like the house itself was keeping us inside. Peregrine touched the wall gently, like comforting an old friend. "She won't let you leave until it's finished," he said. "The house knows its time has come. It's tired of standing against nature, tired of being a monument to cruelty. It wants to return to the mud, to become part of the bayou again." The water was ankle-deep on the second floor now, rising impossibly fast. Through it, I could see things that couldn't be there. Furniture that had been destroyed decades ago. People in clothing from different eras, all moving through the water like it was air. They weren't threatening, just present, like the flood was bringing back everything the house had ever contained. "The records," Peregrine said urgently, grabbing his journal. "They need to survive. The names, the dates, the truth about what happened here. Someone needs to know." He thrust the journal into my hands, and I saw that it wasn't just names. It was stories, testimonies, a complete history of everyone who had suffered because of this place. The water was at our waists now, warm despite the cold rain outside. It smelled of earth and time, of things that had been buried coming back to the surface. Through the windows, I could see that the outside world had disappeared. There was just water and darkness and the sense of something vast and patient finally getting what it wanted. "There's an attic," Delphine said, practical even in the face of impossibility. "We go up." But Peregrine shook his head. "The attic is where they hid during the 1927 flood. 13 people, mostly children, trapped when the water rose too fast. They're still there, waiting. You don't want to meet them. Trust me." The house groaned again, and this time I felt it settling, sinking into the mud that had always wanted to claim it. We were going down with it, becoming part of the archaeological layer that future generations might discover. If there were future generations. If the water ever receded. "The window," I said. "We break the window and swim for it." Peregrine looked at me with pity. "Swim where?" "Look outside. Really look." I looked, and finally understood. The water outside wasn't flood water. It was older, deeper, something from before humans had mapped this land. It was the original water, the primordial swamp that had covered this area before anyone thought to drain it. And in it, things moved that had no names because they'd existed before language. "You brought us here to die with you," Delphine said. But she didn't sound angry, just resigned, like she'd always known the water would win eventually. "No," Peregrine said, "I brought you here to witness. To carry the story forward. The house will fall. I will go with it. But you too will survive. The water doesn't want you. You're not part of the debt." As if responding to his words, the door suddenly swung open. Beyond it, impossibly, was our ambulance, sitting in 3 inches of water on a perfectly normal street. The storm was still raging, but it was just a storm, not the thing we'd been experiencing. "Go," Peregrine said. "Take the journal. Tell them what happened here. Tell them the water remembered and the debt was paid. We wanted to stay, to pull him out, to do our job as paramedics. But the house was already dissolving around us, walls becoming translucent, showing the swamp that had always been underneath. Peregrine was dissolving too, becoming part of the water, his storm-colored eyes the last thing to fade. We ran through that impossible door and found ourselves standing beside our ambulance, soaking wet and shaking. Behind us, where the house should have been, was just water. Calm, normal floodwater, reflecting the emergency lights of other response vehicles that had suddenly appeared. "There's no house here," one of the other paramedics said. "Hasn't been. For years. The old Lyle place got demolished after Katrina." I still had the journal in my hands, wet but intact. Inside were the names, the stories, the history Peregrine had compiled. But the last entry was different. It was in my handwriting, though I didn't remember writing it. "The water remembers everything. The debt has been paid. The land has been returned." Peregrine Lyle, last of his line, chose to go with the house his ancestors built on stolen ground. He was not forced. He was not murdered. He simply returned to where he always belonged. Delphine and I never talked about what happened in that house that didn't exist. We filed a report saying we'd been unable to locate Peregrine Lyle, that he must have evacuated before we arrived. The journal went to the Historical Society, where it became part of the record of plantation atrocities, though no one could explain how it had survived the flood that destroyed everything else on Bayou Road. The storm passed, the water receded. Life went on. But sometimes during heavy rains, when the water starts rising in the low-lying areas, I think about Peregrine Lyle and his house that remembered its sins. I think about the water that remembers everything, that waits patiently for its chance to reclaim what was taken from it. And I check my watch obsessively, making sure time is moving at the right speed, that 5 minutes is really 5 minutes. and not an hour of borrowed time in a house that's already underwater. We still run calls during floods, still wade through rising water to reach people who won't evacuate. But now I pay attention to the patterns in the water, the voices in the rain, the way some houses seem to want to fall while others stand defiant. Because Peregrine Lyle taught me something that night. Sometimes the water isn't just water. Sometimes it's memory, justice, and patient vengeance all mixed together, waiting for the right storm to set things right. The call came in at 9:23 p.m. on a Thursday that felt like it had already lasted a week. I'm Caius Merriweather, and I've been running emergency calls in Manhattan for 8 years. You'd think, after all that time, nothing would surprise me anymore. You'd be wrong. My partner, Ione Blackwell, was checking equipment in the back of the rig when dispatch crackled through with the kind of address that made every paramedic in the city groan. Unit 19, respond to the Wessex Tower, 485 Park Avenue, 57th floor. 68-year-old male, possible cardiac event. Be advised, building reports intermittent elevator failures. May need to coordinate with fire for high-angle rescue. Ione's head appeared through the window between the cab and the patient compartment. 57th floor, with busted elevators. She'd only been working Manhattan for 6 months, transferred from Baltimore, where the tallest building she'd had to climb was maybe 12 stories. Welcome to Vertical Response, I said, throwing the rig into drive. Hope you've been keeping up with your cardio. The Wessex Tower was one of those ultra-luxury residential buildings that had sprouted across Manhattan in the last decade. 82 floors of glass and steel that scraped the sky and cast shadows over half of Midtown. The kind of place where a studio apartment cost more than most people made in a lifetime. The kind of place where the rich went to be closer to heaven, or at least farther from the rest of us. We pulled up to find the building's private security already waiting for us at the entrance. That was never a good sign. These places usually tried to handle everything internally, keeping their residents' problems out of the public eye. If they were meeting us at the door, something was seriously wrong. Elevator's been acting up all day, the security chief, a thick-necked man named Morrison, explained as he led us through a lobby that looked like it had been lifted from Versailles. We've had 3 different repair crews in, but they can't find the problem. Sometimes it works fine, sometimes it stops between floors, sometimes it goes to floors nobody called it to. He paused at the elevator bank, where a sign reading, "Out of order," had been taped over with another sign reading, "Use at own risk." "And you want us to use this death trap to get to the 57th floor?" Ione asked, her voice incredulous. Morrison shrugged. "It's that or the stairs. Your patient is Ambrose Keene, penthouse 57A. He called 911 himself about 15 minutes ago, said he was having chest pains and couldn't breathe. Our concierge tried to check on him, but Mr. Keene wouldn't open the door, said he needed real medical help, not hotel staff playing doctor." I looked at the elevator, its brass doors reflecting our distorted images back at us. Something about the reflection was off, like the brass was old and warped despite the building being less than 5 years old. "How long would the stairs take?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Carrying equipment?" "Probably 30 minutes minimum," Morrison said. "Maybe more." The stairwells are narrow, designed for emergency exit only. Not really meant for going up. 30 minutes for a cardiac patient was too long. We'd have to risk the elevator. "We'll take it," I decided, "but you're sending a team up the stairs as backup in case we get stuck." Morrison nodded and radioed his team while Ione and I loaded our equipment into the elevator. The jump bag, the cardiac monitor, the drug box, the portable oxygen. everything we'd need if Ambrose Keene was really having a heart attack, and everything that would weigh us down if we had to carry it up 57 floors of stairs. The elevator doors closed with a sound like a sigh, and immediately I felt something wrong. The air inside was too thick, like breathing through wet cotton. The lights flickered in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, like Morse code spelling out a warning I couldn't read. And there was a smell, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. "This thing feels older than the building," Ione muttered, running her hand along the wood paneling that lined the elevator walls. She was right. The wood was scarred and worn, with initials carved into it that looked decades old. JH 1987, ML 1962, DR 1973. Dates that were impossible if the building was really only 5 years old. The elevator began to rise, but the movement felt wrong. Not the smooth acceleration of modern elevators, but a jerky, uncertain climb, like something was pulling us up by hand. The floor indicator above the door showed our progress. 5, 8, 11, but then it jumped to 23, then back to 14, then to 31. "What the hell?" Ione said, watching the numbers dance. "Morrison said it was malfunctioning, but this is—" She was cut off as the elevator suddenly stopped. Not a gradual deceleration, but an immediate halt that sent us stumbling. The lights went out completely for a moment, then came back on, but dimmer, older somehow, like we were seeing by gaslight instead of the electricity. The floor indicator showed 27, but when the doors opened, the hallway beyond didn't look like it belonged in a luxury building. The walls were water-stained. The carpet was a moldy green that might have been fashionable in the 1970s, and the air smelled of cigarette smoke and decay. "This isn't right," I said, hitting the door close button. But the doors wouldn't close. They shuddered, trying to come together, but something was blocking them. Something we couldn't see. "We need to get out," Ione said, her hand moving to her radio. But the radio was dead, just static that sounded like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. Our phones showed no signal, their screens flickering between the normal display and something else. Text messages we'd never received from numbers that didn't exist. I stepped out into the hallway, and immediately the wrongness intensified. The hallway stretched in both directions farther than it should have, with more doors than any floor plan would allow. The numbers on the doors were wrong too. 2743, 2799, 27-X, 27-null. Mathematics that didn't belong in physical space. "We need to find another way up," I said, looking for a stairwell sign. But the signs on the walls weren't in English anymore. They weren't in any language I recognized, just symbols that hurt to look at directly. Ione grabbed my arm. "Caius, look." She was pointing at one of the doors, 27-13, which was slightly open. Through the gap, we could see into an apartment that shouldn't exist. The furniture was from different decades all mashed together. A Victorian sofa next to a 1960s television playing static next to a modern laptop that was somehow running, despite not being plugged in. And standing in the middle of it all was a man in a paramedic uniform. But the uniform was wrong. Outdated, the kind they'd worn in the 1980s. He turned to look at us, and his face was familiar but impossible. It was me, but older, grayer, with eyes that had seen too much. "You shouldn't be here yet," the other me said. "It's not your time. You need to get to Keene before the building takes him completely." Before I could respond, the door slammed shut, and when Ione tried to open it again, it was locked. The brass nameplate that had read 27-13 now showed a family name, the Merriweathers. My name. My family name on a door in a building where I'd never lived, on a floor that shouldn't exist. The elevator, Ione said, pulling me back. We need to get back in the elevator. But when we turned around, the elevator was gone. Where it had been was just a wall, solid and unbroken, like it had never been there at all. We were trapped on a floor that shouldn't exist in a building that was somehow more than just a building. The stairs, I said, trying to stay calm. There have to be stairs. We found them at the end of the impossible hallway, behind a door marked with symbols that seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at them. The stairwell was narrow and dark, lit by emergency lights that flickered like candle flames. As we climbed, I could hear voices echoing from above and below. Some of them sounded like they were calling for help. Others sounded like they were warning us to go back. On the landing between what should have been floors 29 and 30, we found graffiti that made my blood run cold. It was a list of names and dates, all paramedics and EMTs, all who had apparently died in this building. But that was impossible. The building was only 5 years old, and I knew for a fact that no emergency responders had died here. "Look at the dates," Ione whispered. The deaths were spread across 50 years, some dating back to the 1960s, all in a building that had been constructed in 2019. At the bottom of the list, in fresh ink that was still wet, someone had written, "Caius Merriweather, pending. Ione Blackwell, pending." "We need to keep moving," I said, though my legs felt like they were made of lead. The stairs seemed to go on forever, turning and climbing through dimensions that didn't match the building's exterior. Sometimes we'd climb up and find ourselves on a lower floor number. Sometimes we'd pass the same landing multiple times, each time with slight differences, like we were moving through alternate versions of the building. On what the door claimed was floor 43, we heard the elevator ding. The doors opened in the wall where no elevator shaft should be, and inside was Morrison, the security chief. But he looked different. Older, his uniform from a different era, his eyes hollow and unfocused. "You're running late," he said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Mr. Keene has been waiting for so long, so many years. The building won't let him go until someone comes to witness." "Witness what?" Ione asked, but Morrison was already gone, the elevator doors closing on empty space. When I pressed the call button, nothing happened. The elevator was gone again, like it had never been there. We kept climbing. Floor 45, 48, 51. The numbers stopped making sense, but we kept going up because there was nowhere else to go. The stairwell behind us had become something else, the steps we'd already climbed transforming into smooth wall when we looked back. The building was reshaping itself around us, herding us toward the floor 57, toward Ambrose Keene. Finally, impossibly, we reached a door marked 57. The metal was cold to the touch, colder than it should be, and when I opened it, frost formed on my fingers. The hallway beyond was the luxury corridor we'd expected to find, all marble and crystal and soft lighting. But it was wrong, too. The marble had veins that pulsed like arteries. The crystal chandelier was made of what looked like frozen tears, and the soft lighting came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Penthouse 57A," Ione read from an ornate sign. "This is it." The door to the penthouse was open, spilling warm light into the cold hallway. Inside, we could hear classical music playing, something baroque and complicated. We entered carefully, our equipment suddenly feeling inadequate for whatever we were about to find. The penthouse was enormous, the kind of space that shouldn't be possible given the building's footprint. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed views of Manhattan from angles that didn't exist, showing the city at different times of day and night simultaneously. And in the center of it all, in a leather chair that looked like a throne, sat Ambrose Keene. He was thin to the point of emaciation, his expensive suit hanging off him like it was draped on a skeleton. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could see his veins pulsing with something that wasn't quite blood. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something beyond the physical space of the room. "Mr. Keene?" I approached slowly, setting down my equipment. "We're paramedics." "You called for help?" His head turned toward me with a movement that was too smooth, too mechanical, like a doll on a pivot. When he smiled, his teeth were too numerous, filling his mouth in rows like a shark's. "Finally," he said, his voice layered like multiple people speaking in unison. "I've been waiting so long. Since 1962, when the building first called to me." "The building wasn't built until 2019, Ione said, but even as she said it, we both knew that wasn't entirely true. The building existed in 2019, but it also existed in 1962 and 1873, and possibly times that hadn't happened yet. It was a nexus, a point where different times and realities pressed against each other." "The building is older than time," Ambrose said, standing up with movements that defied anatomy. His joints bent in directions they shouldn't, his body unfolding like origami in reverse. "It was here before the city, before the island, before humans walked upright. It just wears different faces in different eras. This is its current face, but underneath it's always been the same structure." He walked to the window, and I noticed he didn't have a reflection in the glass. Neither did Ione. Neither did I. The windows showed the city, but not us, like we had already ceased to exist in the normal world. "Every building in Manhattan is just an echo of this one," Ambrose continued. "Every skyscraper, every tower, they're all trying to recreate what this building has always been. A connection between the earth and the sky, the living and the dead, the real and the impossible." His medical records were spread out on a coffee table that looked like it was made from compressed newspaper clippings. I glanced at them and saw impossible things. Medical reports from doctors who wouldn't be born for another decade. Death certificates dated in the future. X-rays showing organs that humans didn't possess. "You called for medical help," I said, trying to ground us in our purpose. "Are you having chest pain? Difficulty breathing?" Ambrose laughed, a sound like glass breaking in reverse. "I'm having difficulty existing. I've been in this building too long, and it's transformed me into part of itself. Look." He opened his shirt, and where his chest should be was a cavity filled with elevator cables and electrical wiring. His heart was visible, but it wasn't pumping blood. It was pumping something that looked like liquid light, circulating through tubes that disappeared into the walls of the apartment. "The building needs caretakers," he explained. "People who understand its nature, who can help it function across all its timelines. I've been doing it alone since 1962, but I'm tired. The building brought you here to replace me, or to join me. It hasn't decided yet." Ione was backing toward the door, but when she tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. We were sealed in with Ambrose and whatever he had become. "We're not staying," she said firmly. "We're emergency responders. We have other calls, other patients." "Do you?" Ambrose asked. "Check your radios, check your phones, check your watches." Our radios were silent, not even static now. Our phones showed no date, no time, just screens full of symbols that hurt to look at. My watch was running backward, the second hand ticking counterclockwise, undoing time with each movement. "Time doesn't work the same way in the building," Ambrose said. You've been here for 3 minutes and 3 years simultaneously. Your unit has been reported missing in one timeline, while in another you haven't even arrived yet. The building exists in all times at once, and now so do you. I could feel it then, the weight of the building's impossibility pressing down on us. My memories were becoming confused, mixing with memories that weren't mine. I remembered responding to calls in this building in 1987, even though I would have been a child then. I remembered Ione dying in a stairwell collapse that hadn't happened yet. I remembered Ambrose Keene, young and healthy, calling for help that would take 60 years to arrive. You need to choose, Ambrose said. Become part of the building's emergency response system, existing across all timelines to help all versions of its residents, or resist and become like the others. What others? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. He gestured to the walls and I saw them then. Faces in the marble, pressing against the surface like they were trapped just beneath. Paramedics, EMTs, firefighters, police officers, all the emergency responders who had entered the building across its various timelines and had refused its offer. They were part of the structure now, conscious but frozen, aware but unable to act. The building needs witnesses, Ambrose explained. People to observe its existence, to validate its impossibility. Some serve willingly, like me. Others become architectural features, but all feed the building's need to be acknowledged. I looked at Ione, saw my own terror reflected in her eyes. We were medical professionals, trained to handle emergencies, to save lives. But this was beyond our training, beyond our understanding. This was a building that existed outside normal space and time, that transformed people into components of itself, that needed human consciousness to maintain its impossible existence. There's a third option, Ione said suddenly. We treat you. Actually, treat you, not for cardiac symptoms, but for what's really wrong with you. Ambrose tilted his head, curious. And what's wrong with me? You're disconnected, she said, pulling out her equipment with hands that barely shook. Not from reality, but from humanity. The building has isolated you, made you into something between human and architecture. But you're still partially human, which means you can still be stabilized. It was insane, but I understood what she was trying to do. If Ambrose was the building's primary caretaker, its main connection to human consciousness, then treating him might affect the building itself. I joined her, pulling out the cardiac monitor. When we attached the leads to Ambrose's chest, around the cavity of wires and cables, the monitor showed something impossible. Not a heart rhythm, but the building's rhythm. The electrical pulse of elevators rising and falling, of lights turning on and off, of water flowing through pipes. The building's vital signs displayed on our medical equipment. Your pulse is the elevator cycle, I said, reading the patterns. Your blood pressure is the water pressure in the pipes. Your respiration is the air circulation system. You haven't become part of the building. The building has become part of you. Ambrose looked surprised for the first time. I hadn't considered it from that angle. We worked with desperate efficiency, not treating Ambrose's body, but treating the building through him. When we administered medications, we weren't injecting them into his veins, but into the building's circulation system. When we provided oxygen, we were aerating the building's stagnant air. It was medicine as metaphor, treatment as ritual. But somehow, it was working. The walls began to solidify, losing their organic pulse. The impossible geometry of the penthouse started to resolve into normal angles. The faces in the marble faded, released from their architectural prison. You're separating us, Ambrose said, and he sounded both terrified and relieved. After all these years, you're pulling us apart. The building shuddered. Elevators throughout the structure suddenly coming online, their cables singing like harp strings. The lights flickered in a pattern that might have been Morse code for thank you, or might have been random electrical discharge. Time reasserted itself, our watches spinning forward to show 10:47 p.m., only an hour and 24 minutes since we'd received the original call. Ambrose collapsed back in his chair, and when he opened his shirt again, there was just an old man's chest, scarred but human. His pulse was rapid but regular, his blood pressure high but not critically so. He was having a cardiac event, a real one this time, brought on by the stress of being suddenly separated from the building he'd been bonded to for decades. We treated him with normal protocols then. Aspirin, nitroglycerin, oxygen. Real medicine for real symptoms. As we worked, the penthouse continued to normalize around us. The windows showed only one view of Manhattan, the correct one for a Thursday night in the present. The walls were just walls, the floor just marble, the air just air. The building, Ambrose gasped as we prepared him for transport. It's dying without me. Can't you feel it? I could feel something, a sadness in the structure around us, like the building was mourning the loss of its human component. But it wasn't dying. It was just becoming ordinary again, returning to its mundane existence as an expensive apartment building instead of a temporal anomaly. The elevator arrived when we called it, perfectly normal, carrying us smoothly down to the lobby where our backup was waiting. They'd been about to storm the stairwells, thinking we'd been trapped for over an hour. Morrison, the normal Morrison from the correct timeline, helped us load Ambrose into the ambulance. Strange thing, he said as we prepared to leave. The elevators all started working perfectly about 5 minutes ago. Whatever was wrong with them just fixed itself. We transported Ambrose to Mount Sinai, where he was admitted for cardiac observation. He would recover, the doctors said, though he seemed confused about where he was and kept asking about buildings that didn't exist. Or maybe buildings that existed in timelines we couldn't access anymore. Ione and I never talked about what happened on the floors that shouldn't have existed, in the times that weren't our time. But sometimes when we pass the Wessex Tower on other calls, we see things. Shadows in windows of floors that the building supposedly doesn't have. Elevator lights indicating cars traveling to impossible destinations. And sometimes late at night when the city is quiet, I swear I can feel the building calling. Not just the Wessex, but all the tall buildings, all the skyscrapers that pierce the sky like needles. They're all connected somehow, all part of something larger and older than the city itself. They need caretakers, witnesses, people to acknowledge their impossible existence. But we resist. We stay grounded in the normal world, treating normal medical emergencies, pretending we never learned that some buildings are more than just steel and glass. We pretend we don't know that some structures exist in multiple timelines simultaneously, that some elevators travel through more than just vertical space, that some penthouses are gateways to architectural impossibilities. This is my city. These are my buildings. And somewhere in them, in the spaces between floors, in the moments between elevator stops, in the walls between apartments, existence itself is negotiable. Some people, like Ambrose Keene, negotiate themselves into something beyond human. Others, like Ione and me, pull them back before they're lost completely. We're not just paramedics. We're anchors, keeping people tethered to consensual reality when the buildings try to claim them. It's not in our job description, but it's become part of what we do. Because in a city of 8 million people and countless buildings, someone has to stand between humanity and architecture, making sure the structures that shelter us don't consume us entirely. The radio crackles. Another call, another high-rise, another patient on an impossible floor. We respond, as we always do, carrying our medical equipment and our knowledge that sometimes treating a patient means treating the building they've become entangled with. And always, we take the stairs when we can, because elevators in Manhattan don't always go where they claim they're going. Sometimes they travel through time, through dimension, through states of existence that have no names. And once you've ridden one to a floor that shouldn't exist, you can never quite trust them again.